In this video, we are going to be continuing on the topic of graphs. In the previous video, we were given the plot of a graph and we were asked to find the equation of that graph. Now in today's video, instead of being given the plot and being asked to find the equation, we are going to be given the equation and we will then need to find the plot for that equation. For each question, we are going to need to draw up a table of x and y values, and we are going to use the same x values for each question. These are the same x values that you should use for practically every example unless otherwise stated. And these x values are -2, 1, or rather -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And to find their corresponding y values, all we're going to do is we are going to take each of these x values and we are going to plug them into our equation. For question 2, we are asked to plot the function y equals 2x minus 3. So, step 1 would be to create our table. Once we have our table, we will now need to substitute in our values for x into our equation to find our values for y. So, our first value for x is -2. So, we say 2 times -2 gives us -4, -3, that gives us -7 as our value for y. Next, we have an x value of -1. So 2 times -1 is -2. -3 gives us -5. Our next x value is 0. So 2 times 0 is 0. Therefore, y equals -3. Next, we have x equals 1. So 2 times 1 is 2. -3 is -1. Lastly, we have that x is 2. So 2 times 2 is 4. -3 is 1. Now we have substituted in all our values for x and gotten all of the corresponding y values. So as we can see, each of these x, y pairs are going to be coordinates on our graph on the left hand side. So each of these are x, y pairs which represent coordinates on this graph. So remember, when we have our graph, we need to make sure that we have our x-axis and y-axis correctly labeled. Once we have all of that, we can start plotting our points. So, as we can see, our first point is x equals -2 and y equals -7. So let's plot that. So we've got x equals -2, which is here, but we need y to be -7, which is here. So where these two lines meet would be over here. So here we have the point -2 and -7. Our next point is -1 and -5. So x equals -1 would be there, and y equals -5 would be there. So where those 2 points intersect, we make our next point. Our next point would be 0 and -3. So x equals 0 is the same as just our y-axis, and where y equals -3, we can then put our next point. And as we can see, our graph is already taking a little bit of shape, right? We can see that just like our original equation said, where we had y equals 2x minus 3, we can see that our gradient is positive, and we can also see that our y-intercept, which is given by c, is -3, and that's exactly where our graph cuts the y-axis. Next, we're going to plot the point 1 and -1. That would be over there, because that is where x is equal to 1 and y is equal to -1. Lastly, we plot the point x is 2 and y is 1, so we're plotting the point 2, 1, and that would be over there. So now that we have plotted all of our points, we now need to connect each of these points. To do this, we will use a ruler and line up all the dots, and we will connect all of the points. Our last step is to just indicate what the function was, and that is y equals 2x minus 3. And that is how we plot the function given to us. For question 4, we are asked to plot the graph of 3 times, and in brackets we have x minus 1. So before we can continue, we need to multiply out the brackets. So we'd get that y equals 3x minus 3. So this is now the equation that we're going to use when we're plotting the graph. So since we now have our equation, we can now create our table. Once we have our table, we then need to substitute each of these x values into our equation. So we start off by substituting in -2 into the place of x, and we get that 3 times -2 gives us -6, -3 gives us -9. Next, we substitute in x equals -1, so we say 3 times -1 gives us -3, -3 gives us -6. Next, we have x equals 0, so 0 times 3 gives us 0, -3 gives us -3. Next, we're going to substitute in x equals 1, so 3 times 1 gives us 3, -3 gives us 0. Lastly, we substitute in x equals 2, so we say 3 times 2 gives us 6, -3 gives us 3. Now we have 5 points which we are going to plot on our graph. So first up we have x equals -2 and y equals -9, and that will be over there. Right, next we have -1 and -6, and that will be over there, because that is where x is equal to -1 and y is equal to -6. Next we have 0 and -3, so x is equal to 0 and y is equal to -3. Next we have the point 1 and 0, so x equals 1 and y equals 0, so that'll be over there. And lastly, we have the point 2 and 3. So x is 2 and y is 3, and that would be over there. Lastly, we need to connect these up using a ruler. And once we have done that, we need to label our graph. So that was y equals 3x minus 3. And that is it for question number 4. For number 6, we have y equals 2 minus x. Once again, we need to create our table. So now we have our table, and just a reminder, we have been using the exact same x values this whole time. those x values being -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. Right, so now that we have our table, we now need to fill in our y values. And to do that, we are going to take each of these x values and substitute them into our formula for y. Okay, so we have for the first one, y equals 2 minus. Now what is x for the first one? That is -2. Okay, so 2 minus -2 is 4. Next, our x value is -1. So 2 minus -1 is the same as 2 plus 1. And that gives us 3. Our next x value is 0. 2 minus 0 gives us 2. Next, we have x equals 1, and 2 minus 1 is simply just 1. And lastly, we have that x equals 2. So 2 minus 2 gives us a y value of 0. So now that we have calculated our y values for each of the x values, we now have our set of points which we can use to plot on our Cartesian plane. Remember, our Cartesian plane is this graph over here. So our first point is going to be x equals -2 and y equals 4, and that is over there. Next, we are going to have x equals -1 and y is 3, and that will be over there. Next, we have 0 and 2, which is there. Then we have 1 and 1, which is there. And lastly, we have 2 and 0, which is there. Now, we need to once again connect these points up using a ruler. And once we have finished that, our last step is to label our graph with the equation, which was y equals 2 minus x. And that is it for question number 6. For question number 8, we are asked to plot the function y equals -5x plus 4. So once again, our first step is to draw up the table. Once we have our table, we need to find our y values for each of the corresponding x values. So when x is -2, we can plug that into our equation and we get that y will be 14. Similarly, for -1, we can plug that in, and when x is -1, -5 times -1 gives us 5, so 5 plus 4 gives us 9. When we plug in 0, we get -5 times 0, which is 0, plus 4 gives us 4. When x is 1, we say -5 times 1 is -5, plus 4 gives us -1. And lastly, if we plug in x equals 2, we get -5 times 2, which is -10, plus 4 gives us -6. Next, we are going to need to plot each of these points that we have just created. As some of you may realize, the Cartesian plane that I have provided here will not cater for all of these points. This will not be the case when you guys create your own Cartesian planes, so I don't want to see that there are any points missing from your graph. However, in the video, I will not be able to include this point as it is outside the range of my current Cartesian plane. So, with that being said, we will start with point number 2, which is -1 and 9, and that will be over there. Next we have 0 and 4. After that we have 1 and -1. Then lastly, we have 2 and minus 6. And once again, we need to connect all these points using a ruler. And lastly, after we have finished connecting our points using a ruler, we label our graph. And this was y equals minus 5x plus 4. And that is question number 8. Lastly, for question number 10, we are asked to plot the function y equals x over 3 minus 6. Now, don't let the x over 3 confuse you. It is going to be the exact same procedure as we've been carrying out for the last couple of questions. So, step 1, we once again create our table. Once we have completed our table, we then need to find all of our values for y. So when x is minus 2, we substitute that in, and we get the fraction minus 20 over 3. This can be rounded off to approximately negative 6.7. When x is minus 1, we get the fraction minus 19 over 3, and this can be rounded off to negative 6.3. Next, when x is 0, we will have 0 over 3, which is 0, minus 6, and that will just be minus 6. Next, when x is 1, we get the fraction negative 17 over 3, which can be rounded off to minus 5.7. Lastly, when x is 2, we get the fraction minus 16 over 3, and that can be rounded off to minus 5.3. Next, we need to plot each of these points on our graph. So our first point is going to be minus 2 and minus 6.7, and that will be approximately there. Next, we have the point minus 1 and minus 6.3, which will be about there. Then we have 0 and 6, which is there. Then we have 1 and minus 5.7, which is there. And lastly, we have 2 and minus 5.3, which is about over there. Now, once again, we need to connect these dots up using a ruler. And once we have done that, our last step is once again to write our equation, which is y equals x over 3 minus 6. And now we are finished with question number 10.